Hi, today we're going to talk about Marxism, and it's a short little lecture. So you have a quiz on Marxism. It's important to understand just the basics of Marxism, and some art historians that deal with this kind of approach. So Marxism is art's relationship, specifically in an art history class, to political and economic events in society. Marx writes the introduction to the critique of political economy in 1857 to 59. So this is the 19th century. Excuse me. He talks about arts for art's sake, and he is against it. Arts for art's sake would be the production of art just for making it without any relevance. He believes that art has important things to talk about in relationship to the context of society. And it also reflects the economic historical processes that happen. So Marx thinks that art is a reflection of the economy in the history of its production. He focuses on art production by the working class or the proletariat and its exploitation by the ruling class. I'm so sorry. He also sees artists as commodity. In this work, this is Turner's Slave Ship from the 19th century. It's interesting because a lot of people talk about this work and they lose focus talking about how it's a beautiful seascape. It is a beautiful seascape. Unfortunately, it also shows the cruelty of man, and specifically the cruelty of slavery. And Turner was an abolitionist, which also connects to why he painted this. But what you're looking at is a ship that's in a storm, and the slaves have gotten sick during the transportation in the ship, and insurance won't cover illness. Right? Insurance doesn't cover illness if they die during the transportation when they're in the ship, but insurance would cover basically being overthrown, like being having an accident in the water. So what the owner of the ship does is that he throws all the slaves in the water, and that's what you see in the foreground. And I think it's important to be very aware of not only the context of the painting, what Turner believed about slavery, but also from a Marxist point of view, this relationship between people that are wealthy and powerful and those that do not have power. So keep this in mind when you're looking at these kinds of images that might be unclear. Other people that are dealing with Marxism and writing in conflict to that are Leon Trotsky, and he is a Marxist and he's against formalism. We have Bertolt Brecht, who is against non-figurative painting, and he's pro-socialist art. We have Ernst Fischer, who believes that the mythic reconstruction of the economy of the history of art and the first artist as the inventor of tools. And then we have Walter Benjamin, and how he talks about how works lose their aura. And Walter Benjamin talks about how works lose their aura through photography, which we had mentioned previously. There's an art historian who focuses specifically on Florentine painting and its social background. That's the name of his book. His name is Frederick Antal. He relates the rise of an economic social class to humanistic endeavors and changes in painting such as atmospheric and linear perspective. So Antal is one of these people, like Vasari, right? Vasari, who writes the lives of the artists, that sees artistic progression, but also mentions that in the Renaissance, these changes that you see, such as linear perspective, are directly related to financial progress. And a lot of art historians do agree with him. So this is Giotto's Last Judgment, 1305. And we looked at Giotto when we talked about iconography. And if you notice, Giotto is early, what we categorize as early Renaissance. Most people agree that it's early Renaissance. And we talked a little bit about the Last Judgment and having the patron, right, Enrico Scrovegni, included in the Last Judgment, promising the church and that his family will be less corrupt, of course, him specifically. And this is the detail of, right, the promising the chapel and, being the patron and paying for the chapel. So of course, this has to do with economy and finances and having a patron to pay for everything. Other artworks related to finances would be the tribute money. And this is in the Brancacci Chapel in Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence. And this is Masaccio. So what Antal is saying is that things like atmospheric perspective, which you see in the back, atmospheric perspective is when things are further away and they become gray and hazy. And then linear perspective, which this painting also has, if you line up the different parts of the building, they line up to one point in space. So he's saying that these aspects of Florentine painting specifically have to do with the rise of finances. And in this particular example, the Brancacci Chapel is paid for by the Brancacci family. And they do pick a very obscure story in the Bible, which is the tribute money, in which taxes are collected. And most art historians think that perhaps they're referring also to another tax that's collected during this time period that we don't know if they favor or they're against because they're very wealthy. So in the 15th century, there was a tax in Italy, in Florence specifically, that they had to pay. So we don't know if they liked that or not. So regardless, they're paying for this work in their chapel. And what you see is a continuous narrative. If you notice, the man on the right that has orange and blue, that's St. Peter. And St. Peter is shown twice. He's shown pointing, in which he's pointing actually to the water and how he's going to get the money, believe it or not, out of the mouth of a fish. And then on the right, he's shown paying the tax collector. And the tax collector also appears twice. He's the one that has the short tunic in orange. And you can see, again, him twice in the center and then in the right. And Christ is present with the rest of the apostles. So according to this art historian, all these things have to do with finances. There's been some studies too suggesting that it's really related to mathematics, right? So there's different opinions that mathematics and science became so important in the Renaissance that we see them reflected in the artworks. And then, feminist art historians will say, well, is there really a Renaissance for women that weren't able to study math and science? So all these are important questions to keep in mind when you're looking at Renaissance art. So this is Masaccio's Holy Trinity in Santa Maria della Novella in Florence. This is a fresco. It's for 1428. And when you look at this, it's difficult to appreciate it. In the church, you'll see that it's very three-dimensional. It looks like an actual chapel. And really, that's what they were doing. The family that paid for this, the Lenzi family, there was actually no space for a real chapel. They were all taken up. So they wanted an artist that could create a chapel that looked three-dimensional because they were very wealthy. And you can see the patrons there on the sides in red and in black. And they paid for it so it would look like a real chapel painted, even though it wasn't. So it's quite three-dimensional. It has this barrel vault. It has these columns and pilasters. The barrel vault is the part that goes like this, back into space. And in there, you see Christ on the cross with God the Father up above. And then what looks from a distance like a collar is actually the bird or the dove of the Holy Spirit. And then Mary and John at the foot of the cross. And then at the bottom, you have the skeleton of Adam. And it says, excuse me, it says, what I am, you will become. Okay, meaning you're going to die. So it's a memento mori, reminding people to live a good Christian life because you're going to pass away and turn into dust. So again, mathematics, this one has the 1-point linear perspective, and Antal relates that to finances, and that's the Marxist point of view. Other Marxist art historians are Michael Baxendale, who writes Painting and Experience in 15th Century Italy. Arnold Hauser, who writes Mannerism is a reflection of the times, and it talks about how its disconnectedness, and I'll show you some Mannerist works in a minute, reflect economic and social problems. Svetlana Alpers writes that Rembrandt dealt with the impersonal market value of his work and the value of his own works. And I'll mention that. I'll show you an example also. And finally, T.J. Clark writes about the painting of modern life. So this is Bronzino, this is Hauser that you have here. And Mannerism is an interesting style. It follows the Renaissance, and by many it's seen as a decline. And Hauser mentions that it has to do with economic problems of the time. And as much as it can be a decline, by many people would argue that, there's lots of interesting things about Mannerism that make it worthy of study, regardless if it's a decline or not. So this is Eleonora of Toledo and her son Giovanni de' Medici from 1550. And we see these, even though they're wealthy people, there's this detachment. They're not really, notice her eyes, she's looking to the side. And in some Mannerist works that I'll show you another in a second, besides portraits, you have these very strange characteristics for them. In terms of portraits, you just see this disconnectedness of the sitter, that we have some sort of distance between us and the sitter. Of course, her son, Giovanni de' Medici, is actually looking out at the viewer, but you have a sense of discontent in them, right? That they're not happy. Parmigianino and his Madonna of the long neck is a good example of all the characteristics that we expect to see in a Mannerist work. So Mannerism has nonsensical subject matter, things that don't make sense. It has compression of space. It has elongated figures. And oftentimes they use very strong, unusual color contrasts. And you don't have that one specifically here, but those are the general characteristics. Notice that compression of space with these angels on the left, that very exquisite, but also very sexually titillating leg that's coming down from the angel. Then you have the very elongated neck of the Madonna. It's even called the Madonna of the long neck. There's a poem comparing her neck to the column, and a lot of people have argued that's why she has a long neck. She also has long fingers, toes, and then notice the baby, Jesus Christ. It's a Pietà, of course, and a Pietà is where Mary holds the baby, right? But as an adult, if you think about the Pietà is when they take him off of the cross. So here with the baby, it's supposed to be the Madonna and Child enthroned. But of course, we have a problem. The baby looks like he's dead. And it's because it's anticipating the Pietà of when he's older and taken off the cross. So notice that the baby is, looks like he's, grayish tones, and he's rigor mortis is what we would describe it. The body has already started the process of decay. So very complicated painting. You should also there notice that there's a problem with scale, right? And even though this painting has parts of it that are unfinished, there's a person on the right there, and that's a prophet holding a scroll. So these shifts in perspective, these compressed space, this subject that doesn't really make sense, the elongated fingers and bodies, all form part of Mannerism. And Hauser would argue that these are connected with economics. Other artists do similar subjects again, and other art historians think that it has mostly to do with this dissatisfaction, that they're sort of tired of the Renaissance perfection and the 1-point linear perspective, and they want to do something different. And this is in the Bardi Chapel, and it was actually commissioned by a woman. So certainly a really interesting work that you should want to research a little bit more on your own. Svetlana Alpers talks about Rembrandt, and this is the money changer. This has been, attributed and unattributed to Rembrandt. There's a project called the Rembrandt Project that goes back and forth. trying to figure out which are real Rembrandts or not. But for our purposes, and because she mentions it in her article, I'm going to show you the money changer. And we do know that Rembrandt had financial problems in his life. We know that he declared bankruptcy, and we have an inventory of all his belongings. Rembrandt had a very sad life. His wife and child died. And it certainly impacted his psychological state, and obviously his finances eventually. We know that he loved collecting things, and some people would describe him as a hoarder, which is what you see here. He has all these objects, and he's exchanging money. And what's interesting about Rembrandt that Svelena Alpers mentions is that because he's so into debt, at one point he starts, because people know what a Rembrandt is in this time period. It's not like Van Gogh, who died only having sold one painting and nobody really knew who he was. Everybody knew what a Rembrandt was. And because he owed money to so many different people, he began painting portraits, because portraits was an easy way to be like, look, I have a Rembrandt, because even if he doesn't sign it, it's his face. So in a way, he starts making his own. If you think about his self-portraits as a way to pay his debts, he starts printing his own money, if you will, but with paint, right? So he makes his portraits, and we have upwards of 80, 90 portraits, self-portraits made by Rembrandt, which he uses to pay his collectors. So really interesting. I wanted to talk about what T.J. Clark talks about in terms of modern life and modern painting. This is Titian's Venus of Urbino. This is Manet's Olympia. And we know that Manet was aware of Titian's work and would have seen the Venus of Urbino. And if we compare and contrast them, talking about modern life and what T.J. Clark is talking about, the Venus of Urbino, obviously she has the name Venus. It doesn't really mean she was a Venus. We think it was the Duke of Urbino's courtesan. Some people debate it and say it was his future wife. I have problems with that. We debate that because she has these boxes in the back that are called cassone, and then she has a flower that she's holding, which is a sign of marriage. But this typically wouldn't be a way you would display your future wife. So I'm in the camp that this was a highly paid courtesan, his lover, who waited for him to come back from his travels. And of course, it's a very highly sexual painting. If you notice the half of the painting, that curtain falls exactly in her pubic area. You also have a dog that's a symbol of fidelity, that I'll be waiting for you when you come back. And she's looking out at the viewer in a very come hither look, very sexual, because the major viewer of this painting is the Duke of Urbino. Manet's Olympia, on the other hand, even though it has very much so similarities, so I welcome you to look back and forth, the curtain, the central line that divides the painting. You also have that, the two girls in the back of Titian's piece is now a one woman. It's a Black woman, likely her servant, right? Serving, bringing her the flowers from one of her clients. And instead of a sweet little dog, now we have a cat with its, going like this, with its back arched. And she's wearing shoes, and she has a bracelet and this fancy little bow, and also a flower in her hair. Talking a lot about like nudity as costume, right? The fact that this is something Berger mentions, that you can be nude and it sort of be a costume for you. And you notice that her hand is in a more defiant pose, and she's looking out at the viewer. And this has to do with modern life and also Marxism. She is a worker. She's a prostitute. So it's her relationship as a worker with her relationship with her clients. And a lot of people forget that when they're looking at this painting. It has a lot of complicated nuances. Also within the painting itself, between a working class woman, the prostitute, and her helper, Black slave, and that relationship also. So these are things we have to keep in mind when we're discussing these kinds of works. So T.J. Clark, if you're really interested, he discusses modern life. And because this is a modern painting also of the 19th century, right? It's from 1863. It's when painting becomes about the act of painting itself. So we have a modern painting with a modern subject. What happens is in the Renaissance, you have that window that we talked about with linear perspective, atmospheric perspective. What happens in modern painting, specifically with the work of Manet, is he brings attention to the act of painting, the fact that he's painting something on a canvas. He leaves some areas blank where you can see the canvas peeking through. And we have what's called fracture, which is this brushwork that you can see. And it's this idea that the brushwork that is visible calls attention to the fact that it's a painting. So we have lots of things going on. We have modern subjects and then modern painting itself. So I hope this little mini lecture, you understood a little bit more about Marxism. Remember, you have a quiz. Email me with any questions or concerns.